What is going on? Welcome back to the channel. This week we have a lot of big companies unveiling their earnings, so I want to go over some expectations, where they might be going, and everything else you need to know. But first, make sure to hit that thumbs up, and with that, let's get right to it. So prior to me going over that, I do want to just touch on some of the data points that's coming out this week, because of course these have the ability to really move the market prior to the earnings, so it's good to take note of. So starting off on Monday, you have manufacturing. Forecast right now is 49.8. It has been improving. That 50 is that big benchmark. Anything above that shows more of an expansionary stage within the market. Vice versa, anything below 50 shows more of a contraction. Has been improving ever since it was a low of like 46. And then moving on, Tuesday, Jolt numbers. So this is a forecast of 7.8 million. So it's going to be a fun time with that. You have ISM services as well. So that is on Wednesday. Typicals on Thursday. So initial jobless claims and so forth. Friday, non-farm payroll, as well as unemployment. Unemployment is 4.1. So a lot of opportunity to really get shaken up in the market. That's aside from companies unveiling the earnings. So with that, let's get right to it. So Palantir, currently at the time of doing this video, $82.49 over the last 1 year, up 412%. They have the earnings on the 3rd after hours. 11 cents is that earnings per share. And then for revenue, 781.24 million over the last 90 days, 13 positive, 0 negative revisions to the earnings per share. And just looking at this on a deeper scope, so this 11 cents does work out to be 41.45% year-over-year growth, 10 cents a low, 14 cents a high, based on 18 analysts. And then going over the revenue, that does represent a 28.42% year-over-year growth, 768 the low, 861 million the high. So definitely a lot of room to kind of go in either direction. As far as some expectations, you have the implied move of 11.77%. Palantir is always a very volatile stock, so you can kind of see some of these columns. So this right here is 1 day after their earnings, 3 days, 1 week, and then 2. So roughly it is more oriented, probably around a 55-60% likelihood of them beating. That's based on historical data. And when they do beat, they mean business. They go up like 34%, 49%, 52%. So even though a lot of people do bring up the fact that they are considered essentially overvalued, they bring up the PE, so being 215, very high, but essentially Wall Street still sees a lot of good upside and kind of takes it higher. So as far as the downside, when they do miss on their earnings, they go down roughly around anywhere from, on average, I'd say 15%, 15 to 20%. So it is going to be a very volatile time. That 11.77% implied move does work out to be a kind of a move in roughly $10 in either direction. So something to kind of take note of. So let me know your viewpoint on Palantir. Do you think it's going to be a miss, a beat, and where do you guys see things going? So as I go through these, if you own any of them, give yourself a shout out, and if you have any predictions on where it might be going as well, drop them in the comments. I am going to be doing predictions, but I'm going to be posting it to my Discord, so definitely pop over there and take a look. Link in the description below and also the comments. But moving on to the second one, AMD, very popular one. And on a side note, all these can be played through options, different types of strategies. So if you are looking for different types of strategies, take a look at my Patreon. I have them all free, all listed there, so you can go over the beginner, intermediate, and advanced on how you can kind of make the most money. But AMD, they do have their earnings right over here on the 4th after hours. $1.09 is that earnings per share, 7.53 billion for revenue over the last 90 days, 4 positive, and then 30 negative revisions to the earnings per share. So kind of crazy for that. Moving over to this though, so that $1.09 does represent 41.05% year-over-year growth. $1.02 the low, $1.24 the high. That's based on 37 analysts. Revenue, you have that representing as 22.01% year-over-year growth. 7.4 billion low end, 7.7 the high. So you kind of have analysts flip-flopping all over the place for the most part. And based on this right here, you do have the implied move of 7.79%. So this, for the most part, I do believe is going to be their most highly anticipated or volatile earnings. based on previous ones right here. So historically though, this is where it is rather tame. So aside from their last earnings, which was largely seen as a miss, they don't really like miss all that much. It's very, very flat, sometimes just like a 5% down day. So historically speaking, there is a lot more upside based on this. There's this section right here that I didn't really go over in the last one, but this is just historical data based on if you're doing the 1 day long straddle, short straddle, long straddle 1 week, and then 1 week short straddle. And so ultimately that is option strategies. So you can kind of see how, even though in relation, for instance, the last earnings, it did go down 13.61%. Certain strategies allowed you to earn roughly around 51%. So definitely research options, do what you need to do. But that implied move does represent roughly around $9 in either direction. So 903. So you can kind of plan accordingly. But this is the second stock I'm going to be talking on. Moving on to the third one, Snapchat. So this one I'm not really a fan of, never really been a fan of. To be honest, I've actually made a lot of money shorting this stock. But again, anything can happen. Last earnings, they did go up, and conveniently, that's actually the only earnings that I just overlooked it, didn't short it, didn't do anything, so probably that was meant to be. But they have the earnings the 4th after hours. 14 cents is that earnings per share. 1.55 billion in revenue over the last 90 days. 25 positive, 2 negative revisions to the earnings per share. Giving you a further overview, so that earnings per share does represent 76.08% year-over-year growth. 11 cents the low, 16 cents the high. And then moving over to revenue, 13.78% year-over-year growth. 1.54 billion in for the low end, 1.6 the high. So yep, that's basically that. As far as this goes, 16.45% implied move. So if you are a fan of options, this one is definitely one to do it at. So yeah, fun times ahead possibly. These are some of the implied moves. Historically speaking, they do miss a good chunk of the time. So as I've stated, pretty much I think the fair way to do it is through options and short, of course. But aside from that, last earnings, they did do fairly well, went up like 15%. Day number one. So it looks as though they're somewhat improving from their 2023 and 2022 business model. But again, historically, that isn't all that great. It looks like some updates right here. So insider Michael O'Sullivan did sell 18,000 shares, and that was done on January the 31st. So nothing really crazy, small amount, but that ultimately, that 16% does result in roughly around a 2% swing in either direction. So that is Snapchat. Moving on to Uber. So right now sitting at $66.85. Earnings is on the 5th before the market opens. 60 cents is that earnings per share. 11.78 billion for revenue over the last 90 days. 20 positive and 12 negative revisions to the earnings per share. Giving you a quick overview of this, so 116.99% year-over-year growth. That's for the earnings per share. And then moving over to here, you have 17.3% for that revenue, year-over-year growth. 41.9 million billion for the low end, 44.3 for the high end. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff for this. Moving over to here though, so it's around 7.66% for the implied move, and that does represent a $5 swing in either direction. Historically though, I think it's kind of flat, so some 50-50 for the most part on a beat or a meet, or I guess a miss for that. And yeah, honestly, it ranges from, as far as the worst case scenario, a 10% loss, or seems to be on average maybe a 15% gain. So again, research options, very profitable for stocks like this that pretty much are predictable for their earnings for the most part and stay in a set parameter. So that is your stock right there. Disney, so sitting at $113.06. They do have their earnings on the 5th before the market. $1.43 for the earnings per share. 24.55 billion for revenue, and then 13 positive and 3 negative revisions to that earnings per share. And then moving over to this right here, so That $1.43 does represent 17.35% year-over-year growth. $1.14 the low, $1.58 the high, 25 analysts, and then 24.55 billion for the revenue. That does represent 4.25 or 24% year-over-year growth. So I think Disney, I don't know why, I just have a weird feeling that they are due for a pullback. Consumer sentiment and spending has been rather low-ish, so I think that is going to be directly correlated with Disney. Again, that's just my viewpoint on that, but as far as the implied move, 6.02%, so pretty much one of the most volatile earnings, aside from a couple in like 2023 and so forth. But historically speaking, they usually do miss on their earnings, and on average I'd say at around 7%. That's over the last couple of years. When they do beat though, they do a fairly good job, so on average roughly around 10%. So I think there is a little bit more upside anticipated, and plus, on a side note, looking here, they are on a pretty good trend. But I think just the expectations for this earnings are very, very high. So maybe just analysts are setting them up for failure. My own thoughts, of course. But moving on, ARM. So sitting at $159.55. Their earnings is on the 5th after hours. 34 cents is that earnings per share. 947 million for revenue, 13 positive, 7 negative revisions to the earnings per share. Earnings per share does represent right over here 17.62% year-over-year growth. That's based on 27 analysts. 14.94% year-over-year growth for their revenue. And even looking forward, you can kind of see just very good amount of growth for this stock. So definitely it came out of nowhere. I IPO'd, I traded it, and around the $60 range, and I kind of wish I did hold it for a little bit longer, but whatever, you win some, you lose some ultimately. But as far as this goes, 9.46% is that implied move, so pretty much on the tame end, if that makes sense. But over the last earnings that have come out, they've missed on the last couple, which results in roughly on average like a 10% down day. Upside, when they do have beats, they usually go up quite a lot, as you can kind of see. So as far as this goes, they are on kind of opposite to Disney. They are going on a little bit more of a negative trend, but analysts still do continue to have high expectations for them. So once again, they might potentially miss on their earnings. So that 9% does equate to roughly a $15 swing in either direction. So this one will be a volatile one that you can kind of play through options. Amazon. So Amazon's a hot one that everyone's going to be watching, but $237, that's what it's sitting at right now. For their earnings, it is on February the 6th after hours. $1.49 for the earnings per share, 187 billion for the revenue. Over the last 90 days, 36 positive and 2 negative revisions to the earnings per share, and ultimately earnings per share equates to 48.61% year-over-year growth. Revenue is 10%, so 10.17%. Still though, if you think about it, 187 billion, like they act like that's nothing, essentially. So yeah, this stock is a absolute beast. They are on a very good trend, as you can kind of see, so hopefully they'll be able to continue that. But similarly, like I mentioned, analysts have a little bit higher expectations this earnings, so something to keep in mind. 5.74% is that implied move. Historically speaking, Amazon does beat on their earnings and usually goes up on average around, I'd say, 7 to 10%. And the downside, when they do miss, they go down. They haven't really missed all that much. Like I think their 2 earnings ago went down 3.5% after the 2 weeks, but in 2023 they did miss quite a lot, and that went down on average, I'd say like 15% for the most part. So I think there is definitely a lot more upside than down. That 5% implied move does equate to about $14 in either direction. Moving on to the next one, E.l.f. So this one I'm not really a big fan of. I've traded it a couple times, gave it as a buy signal under my Patreon, which made a lot of good money during right over here. But as of right now, though, sitting at $99 and change, So you have February the 6th after hours, 76 cents for the earnings per share, 329.91 million for the revenue. Over the last 90 days, 1 positive, 15 negative revisions to the earnings per share. So like I said, I think just people are maybe done with it a little bit, or at least somewhat bearish. Could be linked to consumers, but as of right now, earnings per share does represent 2.45% year-over-year growth, and then the revenue 21.77%. So still though, good money. 329 million is definitely pretty good. Somewhat mixed, so no confirmed real trend, but similarly, you have a lot of just analysts raising the bar and expectations on a lot of these stocks. So I don't know if they're really setting them up for failure, but historically speaking, they actually do very, very well on their earnings. Implied move 12.43%, so it's kind of on the high end of the volatility, but like I said, historically speaking, they do result in roughly around like a 20% push higher. So maybe this is just one of those types of scenarios that high expectations, but they'll exceed that and it'll kind of move higher. So yeah, I can't argue with this data. So even more reason to really do a good option strategy, because you can make a lot of money that way. And so that 12% anticipated implied move does equate to roughly a $12 move in either direction. So let me know your viewpoint. Affirm sitting at $61.07. So earnings right now is on February the 6th after hours, negative 23 cents for the earnings per share. 807 million for the revenue. Over the last 90 days, 4 positive and 4 negative revisions to the earnings per share. 58.22% is that year-over-year growth for the earnings per share, and then 36.58% is that year-over-year growth for their revenue. So this one I feel like is quite popular. Right now they have been on a fairly good trend the last several earnings. Implied move 13.29%, so very volatile. Historically is roughly around a 50-50 on when they do beat and when they miss. And in both cases, you have extreme moves. Both seem to be above 15% in either direction. So even more reason to make a lot of money through options. But this 13% implied move ultimately equates to roughly around an $8 swing in either direction. And I was actually very lucky. I have some options on Affirm. When it was like getting beaten up, I did sell a lot of puts at $25. They come due, I think, in June, I believe, or it might be April actually. And yeah, those will expire worthless, easy money. So take advantage of a lot of volatile stocks, such as Affirm when they do sell off. But last but not least, I swear this is one of my longest videos I've ever done, but Canopy Growth. So I don't invest in cannabis. I think it's just a losing business, but a lot of people really do like it. So I think this one will be a hot one, sitting at $1.99. Earnings is on Friday, so the 7th pre-market, negative 16 cents for the earnings per share, 48.52 million for the revenue. Over the last 90 days, 2 positive, 2 negative revisions to the earnings per share. And then 78.82% is that year-over-year growth for the earnings per share, and then negative 27% for the revenue. So that's definitely not a good thing to ever see, is negative growth for that. They have been on a little bit of a negative downtrend right now. 11.96% is that implied move. And historically speaking, they miss pretty much every single earnings. So it is fair to assume this time around will be the absolute same. That 11% does equate to a 24% or a 24-cent swing in either direction. So this is basically the top 10 that I feel that you can play through options or just that are popular. So let me know your viewpoint on these. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up and subscribe. I always greatly appreciate that. One final thing, pop over to my Patreon where I give buy signals on stocks, options, and crypto. Many of them have been absolute bangers, so pop over there and take a look. Link in the description below and also the comments. With all that, appreciate all of you watching.